The US dollar isn't slipping, it's signaling. A year into Trump's second presidency, the dollar has fallen about 10% over the past year, and it just posted a sharp one-day drop of around 1.3%, sliding to its weakest level since February 2022, roughly a 4-year low on the dollar index. That's not a headline. That's a warning siren. CNBC Reuters. And here's the shocking claim. This isn't about Trump mismanaging a few levers. This is the next phase of a historical pattern that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be spun away, and cannot be voted out. I'm Nick and Wright now. Pause for just a second and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country and time in the comments. I read them all, and it's honestly incredible to see how far this message is traveling. This channel has become a global space where people from all over the world are questioning the same system at the same time. And that tells us something powerful. If these videos help you see things more clearly, make sure you subscribe. One click keeps you connected and ensures you don't miss what's coming next. Also, join our community on WhatsApp and follow us on X for real-time updates, deeper discussions, and breaking insights that don't always make it into the videos. All the links are waiting for you below. Now, back to what I just said, because this isn't a vibe, it's a warning. It's the stress test every reserve currency eventually takes. And when it starts, it doesn't stop politely. It accelerates. Because the mechanism is not political. It's systemic. And if you understand that, you can position before the crowd does. Now lock in, because I'm going to show you the exact 4-stage system that keeps repeating across empires, governments, and currencies, no matter who's in charge. Then I'm going to map it directly onto what's happening right now in the US dollar, US debt, and Trump's widening pressure points. And yes, we'll get to the part nobody wants to say out loud. The part where a weaker dollar is great, stops being a quote, and becomes a trap. Because President Trump was asked directly if the dollar had declined too much, and he said, "No, I think it's great. The dollar is doing great." CNBC markets didn't clap, they flinched. And as Reuters put it, traders weren't willing to catch the falling chainsaw that is the US dollar. Reuters, a falling chainsaw. That is not the language of minor volatility. That is the language of step back or you bleed. And here's the credibility anchor you need right now before we go deeper. Global debt has surged to near $346 trillion according to the Institute of International Finance. That's the backdrop. The world is leveraged to the ceiling, and the dollar is the central plumbing of that leverage. Reuters. So when the dollar's confidence premium cracks just a little, everything priced off it starts to shake. That's why this is urgent. Not because the dollar dipped, because the dollar dipping is how the system tells you the next stage is already starting. Here's the pattern. 4 stages, chronological, relentless. Stage 1 is setup. This is when the system builds credibility. A currency becomes the safe place, the default, the cleanest shirt in the laundry basket. It happens when a country has productive capacity, military reach, deep capital markets, political stability, at least relative to everyone else, and a central bank that markets believe can say no. In this stage, the currency is not just money, it's trust, packaged. It becomes collateral for the world. Stage 2 is expansion. This is where the advantage becomes addictive. Because once the world wants your currency, you can borrow cheaper, you can run deficits longer, you can print more subtly, through credit creation, through central bank balance sheet expansions, through financial engineering that doesn't look like printing until it's too late. Your currency becomes not just a store of value, it becomes a tool of power. And when power becomes a tool, the temptation is always the same. Use it more. Stage 3 is overextension. This is the phase where more becomes too much. Debt piles up, commitments multiply, institutions get pressured, and the world begins to sense something dangerous. The issuer is no longer protecting the currency, the issuer is using the currency, and the moment the market senses that, it starts pricing a credibility risk premium. That premium doesn't show up as a headline at first. It shows up as weird moves, as hedges, as gold catching a bid, as foreign investors buying US assets but hedging the dollar exposure, as whispers that become positioning. Stage 4 is crisis and the inevitable outcome. This is the part people misunderstand. The inevitable outcome isn't that the currency disappears overnight, it's that the currency loses its privilege. The free lunch ends. The issuer has to pay real rates for real borrowing. The currency becomes just another currency. And when the world's reserve currency becomes just another currency, the political system gets squeezed, hard. Because the whole structure was built assuming the privilege would last. Now picture this mechanism like a dam. Stage 1, you build it. Strong concrete, confidence. Stage 2, you route more water through it, more power, more growth. Stage 3, you overload it, tiny cracks appear. Stage 4, you don't vote the water away. The water finds the cracks. It always does. Now you might be thinking, okay, but this is America. This is the dollar. Good, hold that thought, because history doesn't care. History only cares about incentives, debt, and credibility. So let's prove the pattern. 3 examples: short, surgical, and each one has the same arc. First example, Weimar Germany. After World War I, Germany faced impossible obligations, political instability, and a battered productive base. The state leaned on money creation to meet commitments it couldn't meet through growth or taxes. The exchange rate tells the whole story. By November 1923, one US dollar was worth about 4.2 trillion marks. Think about that. A currency didn't fall. It stopped functioning as a measuring stick. Wikipedia. Here's the cliffhanger. When money stops measuring value, what do people measure value with? They measure it with real things. Food, fuel, foreign currency, anything that cannot be printed. Second example, the end of Bretton Woods. For decades, the US dollar was linked to gold at $35 an ounce, but the system required discipline. You couldn't run endless deficits while promising convertibility. Eventually, it snapped. In August 1971, the US suspended dollar convertibility to gold. That wasn't a policy shift. It was stage 3 going public. Trust had been overextended, and the system had to change its rules to survive. 15 months later, in February 1973, there was a further devaluation under pressure, and by 1973, the fixed-rate system effectively collapsed into a world of floating currencies. U.S. State Department, here's the cliffhanger. When a system changes the rules to stay alive, what does it teach everyone watching? It teaches them rules are conditional. Third example, Britain's 1976 sterling crisis. Britain wasn't some failed state. It was a major power dealing with inflation, deficits, and market confidence loss. In 1976, the UK went to the IMF for a loan, about $3.9 billion, to stabilize confidence. That's stage 3 turning into stage 4, the market forcing discipline from the outside. Wikipedia. Now the question, if Britain can be forced to kneel and America can be forced to change the rules, what makes any modern system immune? Exactly nothing. Now we apply the pattern to the present, not in vague doom terms, step by step. Stage 1, set up the modern dollar system. The dollar is still the world's core settlement unit, core collateral, core reserve asset. The IMF's COFR data has shown the dollar remains the largest share of global reserves, around the high 50% range recently. Even if it drifts over time, it's still dominant. Federal Reserve and the U.S. has what every reserve system needs: deep treasury markets, liquid equity markets, legal infrastructure, and the perception, this matters, that institutions are stronger than personalities. Stage 1 has been in place for decades. Check. Stage 2, expansion. The privilege phase. Because the dollar is the reserve currency, the U.S. can run large deficits and fund them at scale. And here's where the stress test begins to appear in numbers people don't emotionally process. U.S. debt has climbed into staggering territory. Gross national debt has been cited around $38.43 trillion in early 2026 by the Joint Economic Committee. And the deficit isn't a one-time emergency anymore. CBO reported the 2025 federal deficit at about 5.9% of GDP. That's not a wartime spike. That's a structural posture. CBO. Meanwhile, interest is no longer a footnote. In FY 2025, interest costs were reported around $970 billion, approaching the psychological line where interest becomes one of the government's defining expenses. Peterson Foundation. This is the expansion phase, the privilege at work. Still manageable until it isn't. And then the system slides into stage 3. Stage 3, overextension. The credibility premium appears. This is where today's headlines stop being random. Because what are we seeing? The dollar down about 10% over the past year. Reuters A sharp one-day drop around 1.3%. CNBC A 4-year low on the dollar index. Reuters, and crucially, a message from the top that the decline is fine. Not we're monitoring volatility, not we prefer stability, but I think it's great. That matters because currencies are partly policy and partly psychology. When the president endorses weakness, sellers feel protected. That's why Reuters highlighted the perception that officials were effectively giving carte blanche to sell the dollar. Reuters check, verified, undeniable. Now we layer the second pressure point. Foreign holders of U.S. Treasuries reached an all-time high of about $9,355 trillion in November, Reuters reported, meaning foreigners still hold massive exposure to U.S. debt. Reuters. So what happens if the dollar drops 10% while yields pay 4%? A foreign investor can win on bonds and still lose on currency. That is how confidence exits quietly, not through headlines, through hedging, through rebalancing, through risk management, and that's what stage 3 looks like in the modern era. Now you might ask, but isn't a weaker dollar good for exports? Yes, in small doses, but the system doesn't stay small, and here's the trap. Exports are under 11% of US GDP, foreign policy noted, meaning most of the economy doesn't get saved by export competitiveness. Imports get more expensive, inflation risks rise, the Federal Reserve loses flexibility. Foreign policy, a weaker dollar, is great right up until it forces higher rates or sticky inflation. And higher rates with this much debt are gasoline on the interest expense fire. Now add the third pressure point, institutional credibility. The dollar is not just backed by GDP, it's backed by the belief that the US won't politicize the machinery. When markets perceive pressure on the Federal Reserve or pressure on independence, they price uncertainty. Not because independence is a moral value, because independence is a risk control mechanism. And when risk control mechanisms weaken, the market demands higher compensation. That's stage 3. And now we go to the broader stress test that your resource data hinted at, the domestic front. When currency confidence slips, domestic pressure doesn't stay separate. It merges. Because a stressed currency often pairs with stressed politics. Trump's second presidency is facing pressure not just from markets, but from internal blowback on immigration enforcement. So visible that major CEOs reportedly sent internal messages criticizing what's happening. Reuters reported OpenAI CEO Sam Altman told employees ICE is going too far. Reuters and coverage around Apple CEO Tim Cook described him as heartbroken and calling for de-escalation after the Minnesota events. The Wall Street Journal. Then you get the political metric that matters: approval. Reuters Ipsos found 53% disapprove of Trump's handling of immigration, with only 39% approving. Reuters. This is important for one reason. When political capital erodes, the temptation grows to force outcomes elsewhere, on trade, on the Fed, on monetary posture, on messaging. And markets hate forced outcomes. There is nothing markets hate more than uncertainty. Reuters quotes said it bluntly. Reuters check, verified, undeniable. Now we arrive at stage 4, the inevitable outcome pathway. Let me be precise. Stage 4 does not require the dollar to collapse. Stage 4 requires something simpler. The world begins to demand a higher credibility premium for holding dollars. And you already see the outline: a weaker dollar, rising hedging behavior, gold surging as a haven, and public messaging that signals tolerance for depreciation. This is exactly why falling chainsaw is the right metaphor. A falling chainsaw doesn't have to hit the ground to hurt you. It just has to fall far enough that nobody wants to touch it. Now here's where people get it wrong. They say this time is different. No, it isn't. They say technology will save us. Technology doesn't cancel debt math. Technology doesn't cancel political incentives. Technology can increase productivity, yes, but it can't erase the pricing of risk. They say American exceptionalism. America can be exceptional and still face the same systemic constraints every reserve issuer faces. In fact, exceptionalism can speed up the cycle because the more the world relies on the system, the bigger the shock when confidence shifts. Now I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. The crisis phase in modern reserve systems often arrives as a policy dilemma that has no clean solution. Rates up to defend the currency? Okay. Debt service costs surge, rates down to stimulate growth, okay. Currency weakens further, inflation risks rise, credibility premium increases, more borrowing to bridge the gap, okay. Markets ask who the marginal buyer is. And that's when the next disruption doesn't come from an election. It comes from a bond auction that doesn't clear the way people expected. It comes from a currency move that gaps in Asia while the US sleeps. It comes from an institutional conflict that makes investors question the backstop. And at that moment, the average person doesn't have time to learn macro. They panic buy the wrong assets at the wrong price. So here's your mid-video call to action. If you want the next segment where we map the possible paths from here, including what happens if the Fed is forced into a credibility defense, what happens if deficits stay structurally high, and what asset behaviors historically outperform in stage 3 turning into stage 4, subscribe now and watch the next video immediately when it drops. Because this is not entertainment. This is positioning. Now, actionable insight. First, stop thinking in binaries. This isn't dollar strong or dollar dead. This is about regime shift risk. So the practical question is, how exposed are you to a single currency regime? If your income, savings, retirement, and assets are all effectively one bet on the stability of dollar purchasing power and US financial conditions, then you are not diversified. You are concentrated. Second, understand what tends to outperform when credibility premiums rise. Historically, when currency confidence weakens and volatility rises, capital leans toward hard assets with limited supply, quality balance sheets, shorter duration instruments that don't get destroyed by rate shocks, and assets that benefit from currency weakness carefully because not all international exposure is equal. Third, stop waiting for official confirmation. Officials confirm things late. Markets move early. That is the entire point. You don't wait for the fire marshal to announce smoke. You move when you smell it, and we have smoke. A year-long 10% drop, a sharp one-day rout, a 4-year low, and leadership publicly signaling comfort with decline. Reuters CNBC. Now let me close by returning to the pattern. Setup creates trust, expansion exploits trust, overextension weaponizes trust, crisis reprices trust, and the outcome is always the same. The system becomes more expensive to maintain than people assumed, and someone has to pay the bill. The only real question is who pays it. The unprepared pay it through purchasing power loss, bad timing, and forced decisions. The prepared pay it through planning, hedging, and strategic patience. That's why you're here. So here's your final call to action. Subscribe. Because the next stage of this pattern does not announce itself politely. And in the next segment, I'm going to lay out the 3 most likely paths from here, the trigger events to watch, and a practical stress test checklist you can run on your own finances in under 15 minutes. Watch the next video. Before the falling chainsaw hits the floor, optional supporting media you can use for thumbnails, B-roll from the sources gathered above, US dollar index decline visuals, image Trump dollar headline style reference, image Minnesota protest, imagery reference, image. If you want, I can now write segment 2 and segment 3 immediately to bring the total script to 5,500, 6,000 plus words, keeping the exact same no subheading, voice over pacing. Just say continue and tell me whether you want the next segment to focus more on markets, treasuries, Fed, gold, or on politics, institutional credibility, unrest first.